first thing I'd like to ask is just to have us give us your name, when you were born, and where you were born.
Okay. My name is Edward Paul Kirsch, Jr. I was junior at the time because my dad was still alive. My name is the same as his. And I was born in Malden, Massachusetts on August 18th, 1917. But I think when I was about 3 years old, my family moved back to New Jersey. My dad and my mother originally came from New Jersey. And he was a lithographic artist and worked for a company in New York. And for some reason or other, he got transferred or he went to Massachusetts to work for a company there. So that's where I was born. And he was registered for the service and during World War I, but was a 4F because he had the family, and I don't know what all the reasons were. But anyhow, he did not serve except as a, what do you call them? The block watch or whatever they call them. So I spent most of my 24 years of my life in New Jersey. We lived in West Orange, New Jersey. We lived in Irvington first, and then in West Orange. And that was the winter between 1933 and 34, when things were real rough, and it was a cold winter when we moved into West Orange. So I went to West Orange High School and graduated in 1935. And went to work then. I was fortunate. I got a job with an insurance company in New York. So I worked in New York in an insurance company. And went to Pace College because I was working for the accounting department in the insurance company, until my best friend's dad was the shop foreman for the Bates Manufacturing Company, which manufactured numbering machines and office helps of different kinds. So I had always been interested in making things, and was there at his house one time. And I was building a model racing car with a gasoline engine, and this was, I guess about 1938 or 39. And Frank Harper saw what I was doing, and he said, "How would you like a job working as an apprentice toolmaker?" And boy, that was right up my line. So I went. And I was working there when, and going with a girl that I knew in high school. Her mother was on a local draft board, and they had already issued the lottery numbers. And she said to me one day, she said, "You know, you got a real low number and you're going to get drafted." And this was probably in November 1940. And so she said, "If you don't want to be a dog face," or whatever they called them, I don't remember, "why, you better do something about it." So I applied for aviation cadets, which then was a branch of the Signal Corps. And they sent me out to, what was the field, where Lindbergh took off. What was the name of that field?
I can't remember. But
You don't remember? You don't remember in the city where it was? Or?
Yeah, it was in New York. Not in the city per se, but on Long Island someplace, I guess. And so anyhow, I went out there, and they called me out there in December for a physical exam. And, it was cold. I went out there and was stripped naked in this place going through this physical exam, and when it was all over, why, some officer in charge out there called me into his office and said that they had discovered they had a history of hay fever or asthma, and that I was not suitable. I was scratched. I was whatever they called it, which was very discouraging. So I went back to West Orange, and I talked to my friend Margie and Bessie Sparks, and Bessie says, well, you better do something or you're going to be in the infantry. So I said, okay. So I went to Newark and enlisted in the Army Air Corps, which it was at that time. And that was in January of 1940. So they sent me from Newark to Barksdale Field, which was Shreveport, Louisiana. And I had never been out of the state before, so rode the train to Washington, D.C. and changed on a train for Shreveport. And I met a young man there who was going to the same place at the same time. And he was from North Philadelphia. So we became buddies after that. And we went to Shreveport, took the basic training there. And during that period of time, why the powers that be asked you for what is your preference for service-connected duties. You know. So my first was aviation mechanic, A&E, airplane and engines. The second was communications, and the third was armament. So when we finished the basic training, they called me in one day and said, well, we have openings in the armament school. If you want to go there, we'll transfer you. I said, where is it? He said, Denver, Colorado. I said, let's go. You know? So they sent me out here to Lowry Field, and I got here in March of 1941. And went through the armament school here, and I have the picture, the certificate, you know, that I graduated from the armament school. So at that time, they were starting the big push to get people through the schools and trained and all of that kind of stuff. So we sent an awful lot of people through the armament school, and they needed instructors, you know, and the instructors were on a volunteer basis at that time. So I liked Denver so much I volunteered. I think it's the only thing I ever volunteered for in my life. And got a job as an instructor, and I worked on the flight line. And we had some good times there. On December 7th, I was in Lowry Field when the war started. And first thing they did was issue everybody sidearms, and they stationed us in the building where they kept all the machine guns and all that kind of stuff to guard the vaults. That was my first experience during the war. So anyhow, after that, why we continued instructions at the armament school. And well, let's see. Then I got a promotion to sergeant, and then they came along and they said that they were sending non-coms with staff sergeant or above to officers indoctrination course, and they made them temporary officers. In fact, I ran into one of the fellows who was an instructor above me. He was a staff sergeant, and I ran into him someplace, and he was a second lieutenant, shaved tail. because I can remember that. I walked into his office and he looked up at me and he said, "Eddie, what the hell are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I just got sent here. I don't know." He said, I said, "I see you're a lieutenant." He said, "Yeah." He said, "I wish I was a non-com again." He didn't like it. So anyhow, when they started building, first thing they did was build Lowry 2, which was on the east side of Lowry Field. And then after that, they started Buckley Field out there was on the old bombing range. However, in the meantime, why we had been running students through the armament school. And in the division, I was in the field division. We had a bunch of airplanes there and some wild experiences. We were working on a night shift. We had students going through there at night, teaching them how to mount machine guns and how to check bomb racks and all of this stuff. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, we had a couple of guys there who were on guard, and they were parading around. And all of a sudden, blam, we hear this shotgun go off. So what was that? This guy who had been, he had drawn extra duty, and because his airplane was dirty, he was a crew chief, and his airplane was dirty, and we heard this blam. He said, "That'll fix that damn bird that shit on my airplane." Things like that went on, you know. We had the armament shop was on one side of Hangar 1. Was it Hangar 1 anyway? Along the edge of the hangar, there were all the shops and offices and stuff. And some smart aleck who was in the armament division figured he was going to catch us. He wired up a booster coil out of one of the old airplanes that we had to the doorknob. He caught the commanding officer with this darn thing. Anyhow.
What happened to the commanding officer? Was he happy?
Not very. I don't remember. We had an experience. We had a P-39, a YP-39, which was one of the original models of the P-39 aircraft. And the guns, it had 4 machine guns mounted in a cowling and a 37 millimeter cannon mounted to fire through the hub, through the propeller hub. Well, they had 2 30 caliber guns on the top and 2 50 caliber guns below that were firing through the propeller. And they were synchronized by an electrical system similar to the distributor on an automobile. You know, so that when the propeller was in a certain position, that gun would fire. When it was in the next position, that gun would fire, and so on. Well, after the students got done assembling the whole deal and checking it out, then one of the pilots there, and this particular man was a captain, would take the airplane and fly it out to the bombing range where they had a target set up in front in a pond or a lake out there in a bombing range way out east. And the reason for that was the guns had to be sighted in, bore-sighted. So they'd go out there and he'd fire maybe 5 or 6 rounds or something out of each gun, and to see where they hit, to see if they were bore-sighted properly, and then come back and report it. Well, this captain, and I cannot remember his name, came in, and that P-39 barely made it, because it came back with a 3-bladed propeller. It had 2 50 caliber holes through one blade and 1 50 caliber hole through another blade. And what had happened was you couldn't check the synchronization of the guns until the engine was over a certain speed. So they had an electrical system, and the cables that ran to the guns were connected to just like a distributor box, and they were indicator lights on it, so that when you turned the propeller, you could tell when that gun should have fired. But somehow the cables for the .250 caliber guns had got crossed. So this one fired when that one should have fired. And I know he was very fortunate that he ever got that airplane back to the field. But as far as we know, it never flew again because it vibrated so badly that everything shook loose. And they did have a big investigation about it. The sergeant who was in charge of that particular group, I was a chief armorer at the time, and the sergeant who was the sergeant in charge of that particular group who worked on that airplane, why, he wasn't held directly responsible for that accident, but he was transferred out, and I have no idea where he went. But they did. The FBI came in there and checked us all out too. So anyhow, that's some of the things that happened there.
I've got a couple of questions. Getting back to Lowry when you were here.
Yeah.
A lot of people who are newer to the area don't realize that Lowry was really a working airfield at the time. What kind of planes were they running out of there, and what kind of operations did they have?
Well, they were running all kinds of airplanes out of there.
Hold on just a second. Since you had to shift there, why don't you just go ahead and start saying that again?
Okay, they ran all kinds of airplanes out of there, mostly experimental planes. The first B-26s flew out of Lowry Field. They had one there. I think it was a YB-26, which is after the experimental models and the post or the pre-production models. And the pilots there were scared to fly that thing because it had such short wingspan and it was so difficult to take off. In fact, a lot of them wouldn't take it off. They taxied it up and down the runway. And then they did a lot. They had the school there, the Armaments School, and of course we flew airplanes that they had, you know, to give the students experience on airplanes that flew. In fact, I flew in some of them myself. They had medium bombers there, B-25s and A-26s. And at one time, we had a flight of P-40Es that were destined for China. You know, the what were they called? The
Was the Flying Tigers?
Flying Tigers, yeah, that's where they were destined. And I can remember when we saw them coming, there was a flight of them came in, and the poor guy that was flying, while they were coming in, they were landing on the north-south runway. And while they were coming in, the wind was shifting around to the east. And we were standing there on the tarmac by the hangar watching these guys come in with these P-40s. Old tail end Charlie, he got the wind, and he was landing in a crosswind. He hit the runway when a gust of wind hit him, and it blew him off the runway, and he hit the embankment where the railroad went across there, the railroad that fed Lowry Field, coming in from the east. It crossed the runway, and then there was a big embankment where the tracks ran across. His landing gear hit that embankment, and that airplane just flipped like that. Landed on its back, and he pulled a canopy, and he fell out of it, and he staggered a couple of steps, and he said, in the meantime, we had run, you know, out there, see what we could do to help. He staggered out of this airplane, and he stood there and he said, well, I walked away from it. Clunk, out he went. he wasn't seriously hurt, fortunately. While I was an instructor there, was it there? Yeah, I guess it was. They had what they called a malfunction lab, where they set up machine guns with purposely malfunctioned, some part missing or some part worn or whatever it was, so the gun, nothing would work. And the student had to take that gun apart and figure out what the malfunction was and reassemble it again, see, and put it back in working order. So after the class was over, we had a long bench, and they used to bring these 30 caliber machine guns in from the lab, from the classroom, and line them up on this long bench. And then they had to be cleaned and whatever had to be done to them. Well, this one poor kid was sitting in a chair about in the middle of this thing, and there must have been maybe 20 machine guns lined up there that had been used in the classwork. And somebody went through and they clicked all the sears, which released the firing pins. See? They clicked the one right in front of that kid. That gun had a round in it. It fired right through his newspaper and killed him. I mean, it was tragic, really. But we were fortunate, fortunate in a lot of ways. We had B-17s come in there right out of Seattle, out of Boeing. They were finished up there and they were flight checked, and they flew them down to Lowry Field. And then we had to check out the armament on them. And that meant the turrets, both turrets, and the bomb racks, and the waist guns and the nose guns. They all had to be checked out. So we were doing that, and I was working with a fellow who was the chief armor. He was a master sergeant, and at that time he was the line chief. And I was working with him, so we opened up the door on a ball turret, which was underneath the airplane. And of course the guns were elevated into wells underneath the fuselage. And you could open the door from the outside then. So we were under the airplane, and we opened up the door to the ball turret. And the guy who had fired him previously was supposed to have cleared him. And we took the back plate off of one of those machine guns and pulled the charging handle back so that the bolt would come back. And the bolt was a block of steel, maybe about 2 inches square. And the only thing that was holding that in was a spring, a heavy spring on a rod. And when we pulled the bolt back with the back plate off, a round dropped out. And if that round had fired, that bolt would have come flying out the back of that gun and killed both of us. So that's why I say, you know, the guardian angels, they were awful busy during that time because they took care of us pretty well. So, but anyhow, that's one of the things that happened at Lowry Field. In addition to that, of course, they had all the airplanes that the school used that they flew, and different types. And then they had all these flights come in for testing, you know, for examination, for proof runs or whatever. Like I said, the B-17s would come right down from Seattle to Lowry Field, and P-40s were coming in there wherever they were made, I don't know. Why, yeah, they would come in there and they had to be checked out. So it was a very active flying field. There were a lot of flights out there. There was a pilot by the name of Philpott. I think he was, he was a lieutenant, first lieutenant. And they had one of the old 30s model biplanes that had been restored. And he loved that airplane. So he would fly it. But Philpott would never take it off on the runway. He'd get outside the hangar there and he'd taxi right to the taxi strip and zoom, away he'd go. So when they started building Buckley Field, this is getting to be quite a recitation. When they started building Buckley Field, they transferred a bunch of us out there. And we were the first cadre who went out to Buckley Field. Why, we got out there, there was 1 or 2 barracks and a bunch of 2x4s standing up in the field in the middle of the prairie, and 1 wooden hangar that they had built, and it was big. So they issued everybody 4-buckle overshoes because the mud was so bad out there. And we'd go into town. You come back at night, and in the meantime, they had dug a ditch across the road. And if you weren't careful, you wound up in the bottom of a ditch where they were putting pipes or something in. So as they began to develop it, why, we started classes out there. And first winter out there, it was cold. It was so cold, and the snow, wind and snow was so bad out there in the prairie. That hangar was 100 feet long, I think, and the snow would come in one end. Oh, for one thing, they had big, heavy wooden doors on tracks across each end, and they opened them up, of course, during the good weather, and then when they tried to close them in the cold weather, the trusses had sagged and the doors only got about halfway closed. When we were out there with a night shift, we had students out there at night. The snow was coming in one end of that hangar and going out the other end without touching the floor. It went through that hangar horizontally. Oh man, that was a cold winter. So anyhow, I was out there, I've forgotten how long now. But we got acquainted. My wife and I were married. I met her at the Post Exchange. We were married there in the Protestant chapel in Buckley Field. And we had an appointment set up with an Episcopal chaplain because we're Episcopalians. And we went to the chapel at this particular, I think it was set up for 4 o'clock in the afternoon on this particular day. So we went out there and we had our witnesses, and we sat down in the front pew in this Protestant chapel, and we waited. Nothing happened. Nobody showed up, and we waited and we waited. And just before 5 o'clock, an officer walked through there, and he said, "Oh, can I help you with something?" And we said, "Well, we were waiting for Chaplain, whatever his name was, and he hasn't come." He says, "Well," he said, I told him, he was supposed to marry us here. He said, "Well, I think he's left the post already." So he said, "But I can do the service." He said, "I'm Lutheran, but if that makes any difference." I said, "No, that don't make any difference." So we were married in a Protestant chapel at Buckley Field, and when we were through with the ceremony, they fired off the cannon. But it was 5 o'clock and they were having retreat at the same time. So we always thought they fired off the cannon in celebration of our wedding. And so it wasn't too long ago when we were talking about this, and I said, "Gee, I'd like to wonder if the chapel is still there." So I called Buckley Field, and I think the man that I talked to was the commanding officer of the Air National Guard out there, and he said that no, the chapel was gone, and he said you wouldn't recognize the place anymore. because we thought maybe we could visit. You know? So anyhow, that's a story about that. Anyhow, then I was the chief armorer at Buckley Field. And the armament officer was a man by the name of Lieutenant Farley. And he was a first lieutenant. And he and I got to be very good friends. So when our son was born, why, incidentally, our first son was born in Fitzsimmons Hospital. And I always said he was born in the same room where Eisenhower had his heart attack. But of course he didn't believe me. Anyhow, Lieutenant Farley and I got to be pretty good friends. And he and his wife were very good to us and our family. We lived in East Denver at the time. We were living off the post. And I often wondered what happened. Oh, he would walk in every once in a while and he'd say, "God, I wonder when I'm going to make captain. When am I going to make captain?" One day he walked in the office, the armament office, when the commanding officer was there. So, "When am I going to make captain?" So, you know, he got all kinds of static about that too. But eventually he did make captain. One of the reasons we were such good friends was because he came from Asbury Park, New Jersey, where his family had an automobile dealership.
What about Buckley? You were talking about that was a very new base at that time. They had a hangar out there. What kind of operations were they doing there?
As far as I know, as I can remember, the principal operation was the armament school. But of course, Lowry had the photography school, and they had the aviation cadets there, and the armament school, and what else I don't know. But I do know that the photography school and the aviation cadets were there, as well as the armament school.
Was Denver built up close to Lowry, or was Lowry kind of out in the middle of nowhere at that point with Denver?
No, it wasn't, really. It was out at Quebec, was where the entrance was. And we used to ride the streetcar out there, because there was a turnaround at Quebec Street. And that was the north or the northwest gate or whatever they called it. And that was the section that they had built when I first went out there in March of 1940. And because that was all new construction too at the same time. I can remember one fella who was in that class, and I'm sure his picture is on there. His name was Agard, and he was from North Carolina or South Carolina, someplace in the South. And they used to go out and they would get smashed. And at that time, it was, of course, when they were building that section of Lowry Field, it was all mud and excavation and all that kind of stuff. So they issued everybody overshoes, you know, because March was wet and muddy. And old Agard, he got drunk one night and he staggered in. And he had these 4-buckle or 5-buckle overshoes on and waded through the mud, and they were mud clear up, and got into the barracks, stripped off all his clothes right down to the bare skin, put the overshoes back on again, and climbed into his bunk. Oh man, he was drunk.
Denver had to be pretty good duty in the sense that you were close to a pretty big city. You weren't isolated on a base in the middle of nowhere.
Boy, Denver was a great soldier's town. When we got here, we had more fun. People were so kind to us. You know, we were invited to everything. Christmas, Thanksgiving, all the holidays, you name it. Not only that, but all the bars and the bartenders were great too. There was a place downtown on 16th Street called Mary's Cafe, and that was a hangout. Mary was Greek. And every GI that walked in there got a shot of ouzo as soon as he walked in the door. And then down the block further, where the Petroleum Club was or is, whether it's still there, I don't know. It's been a long time since we've been downtown. Was a place called the Red Wing Cafe, and that was where I hung out. And the bartender there was great. You know, always had something to eat, always had a drink, and that's the way it was. The people in town. I bought my wife's engagement and wedding rings from a manufacturing jeweler named Whitey Hirschhorn, who had a business downtown someplace on the second floor. He had his workshop and his office. And he sold us rings, and I'm sure that he sold them to us just enough to make his cost, you know. And he invited us. We went out to his house. They were Orthodox Jews, and they fed us. Oh, it was just marvelous. It was a beautiful soldiers' town. There was a place down there on Colfax, on West Colfax, west of Broadway, called the Brown Derby. There was a friend of mine there who lived in Denver, and we thought we had dates one night. And it was cold and snowing, and it was miserable. So we went, picked up his date. We rented a car. We went downtown, and we went into a car rental place. Was right there where the Cosmopolitan Hotel was. And that was on 17th Street, I think, just around the corner from Colfax. And the guy there says, "I won't let you have a car." And we said, "Come on, we got dates and we got to have a car." He says, "Put $100 down on this counter and I'll let you take the car," which we did. That left us broke, practically broke, you know. So we went and picked up his date, and then we went to pick up the girl that I had a date with, and she was gone. She'd gone out with some other guy. So I got stood up. So I said to him, I said, "Well, take me down to the Brown Derby. They're having a roll call down there." Oh man, it was bitter cold and snowing. Walked in the door there and met a couple of guys I knew, and I said, "What are you drinking?" He said, "Port wine." "Great, I'll have some of that. That'll warm me up." So I drank some port wine. And then another bunch came along. "What are you drinking?" "Whiskey sours." Oh man, I'll tell you, port wine and whiskey sours. So when we were ready to go home, some guy who was a civilian, he said he would drive us out to the field. And he had about 6 of us in his car. Man, it got hot and sweaty and the windows were frozen shut. Oh, that was a mess. We got out to the field, got through the gate, and I couldn't go anymore. I laid down in the snow, and I swear they picked me up and dragged me into the barracks. Otherwise, I'd have frozen to death right out there. Jeez, some experiences. So anyhow, one day he came in and he said they reviewed the table of organization, and the armament department is 1 corporal short and 1 tech sergeant over. And that was me, because I had made tech at the time. In fact, he had said to me one time, "I have an opening for either a non-com or an officer's candidate school." So I talked to my wife about it, and Michael was just a few months old, and I hated to leave him and hated to leave Denver. So I told Lieutenant Farley that I'd take the tech sergeant rating, and that's how I got that. And so anyhow, when he said to me that they were 1 corporal short and 1 tech sergeant over the table of organization for the armament department, I got shipped out. And I went out, Air Force unassigned, to Montgomery, Alabama, which was the headquarters for the Eastern Technical Training Command. This out here was the Western Technical Training Command, and Montgomery, Alabama was the headquarters for the Eastern Technical Training Command. So we fooled around there for a while, Air Force unassigned, and eventually, why, yeah, it was from there where they were putting together a cadre to go overseas. And I was on it, along with I don't know how many others. So we were sent from there to Camp Shanks, New York, which was a port of embarkation. And of course, that was close to where my folks were. You know, that was close to West Orange, New Jersey. So, and Doris came up there with Michael to my folks' house, and I went to Camp Shanks, and then of course we went through all that pre-embarkation drill. We climbed cargo nets and God, I don't know what all we did. Got new uniforms issued and tin hats and all this kind of stuff. And every chance I got, I would sneak out and I would hop on a train and go home. And I'd get into New Jersey, to East Orange at maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had to leave again by 4 o'clock to get back to Camp Shanks. So when the day came, they called everybody out. It must have been about 6 o'clock in the morning. They called everybody out of the barracks and lined us all up on the street. And the officer or the duty sergeant or wherever he was stood out there, and he had a roster in his hand, and he said, "The following men are scratched from this shipment." And I was included in the ones that were scratched. And the reason for it was because we had too many points towards discharge. So if they had sent us overseas, we would have been over that limit, see. So they held us back. We sat there on a curb in Camp Shanks, New York, and watched these poor guys go. And I think they had been rationed for 30 days or something like that. So we didn't know where they must have been going halfway to the moon or something. So then when that happened, why, they all climbed on trucks and they took them all off to the harbor and wherever they went. And they left us sitting there. So we said, "What do we do now?" So, well, I don't know. Well, let's go find a mess hall. So we did. We found a mess hall, and only it was on the receiving station where GIs coming back from Europe were disembarked, and the first thing they did was put them in a company there and fed them in this particular mess hall. Well, these guys, it was all staffed by German prisoners of war, all POWs. And they didn't know who we were. We didn't know who they were, you know. And we got in the mess line, and boy, they started feeding us steaks and ice cream and you name it. Man, they put out a big feed. This went on for a couple of days until somebody discovered that we hadn't got off a boat. So then things changed. So anyhow, I got transferred back to Montgomery, Alabama, still Air Force unassigned, and hung around there for a while. And this was after the war was over, or close to the end of the war, and they were cutting down on armed personnel. So they had barracks there set aside. One barrack all full of master sergeants. The next barrack was all full of tech sergeants, and on down the line. Well, they used to call us out every morning for on a duty call. And the guy who was a duty sergeant, he was a buck sergeant. We were all techs and masters, you know, outranked. So he'd stand up there and he would read off the names, and you're assigned to this, and you're assigned to the bachelor officers' quarters where they had to clean up and make the bunks and all this kind of stuff. And so he'd turn his back and everybody would disappear. The ones we did get assigned to was a bachelor officer's quarters. We just walked through and collected all the whiskey bottles and stacked them up on the porch and left. So it was kind of boring, but we made fun out of it. So then I finally got assigned to duty, and they assigned me to Luke Field in Arizona, in Phoenix. And they put us on a troop train in Montgomery, Alabama, and I think it took us 4 or 5 days on this damn troop train between Montgomery, Alabama and Luke Field. And this was in September, and weather in Arizona was beautiful, you know, but the swimming pool had been closed, and I don't know what it was all. So anyhow, I was assigned to the armament department there. And at that time, they were training Chinese pilots in P-51s. So I was that was the airplane that I was familiar with, you know, so I was assigned to the armament department. And I walked in there, and there was a guy sitting behind the desk who was a chief armorer, who I had in school out here in Lowry Field, and he was also an instructor at the same time I was, and he was down there in Luke Field sitting behind a desk as a chief armorer. I walked into his office, and he looked at me and he said, "Eddie, what the hell are you doing here?" I said, "I've been assigned to you." He said, "Get out of here, I don't want you." So we spent a couple of months in building model airplanes and stuff like that until we were called up for discharge. So anyhow, when I got to Luke Field, why, I never had to do very much down there. We were just waiting out the time until we got discharged. But they were training Chinese pilots on in P-51s, Mustangs. And one day, the tower got a call from one of these Chinese guys asking for landing instructions. So the tower gave him landing instructions. And pretty soon he reported to the tower that he was down, he'd landed. And they couldn't find him, they couldn't see him. This Chinese pilot had landed out in the middle of the desert someplace on a road or a strip that he thought was the field. He was miles away from the field, out in the middle of the desert. So that was the experience we had there. But, you know, the time went so slowly until I got discharged. So was happy to get out. And then, of course, they wanted you to go into the reserves. And said, no way. I'd had enough. When my hitch was up at the end of I enlisted for 3 years. And, of course, when the war started, then it was changed to duration plus. See? So when my hitch was up at the end of 3 years, I was ready to go home. And what they wanted to know, you know, was where you had enlisted, and where your permanent address would be. Well, by that time, my wife was in Oklahoma, and so I listed my permanent address as Yale, Oklahoma. And they sent me to Shepherd Field, Wichita Falls, and that's where I got my discharge. So, and that was on December 3rd, 1945. So I had put in my time since, if I remember right, is that correct? Well, you'll see it. No, it was November 1945 when I was discharged. 3rd of November 1945, not December. I had enlisted on January 27th, 1941, and the war didn't start until December 7th, 1941. So I was in all that time before the war started. And then when I was discharged, of course the war was over and Japan had surrendered, was in Montgomery, Alabama when that happened. And November 3rd, was when we got transferred. I got transferred to Wichita Falls and was discharged there. And then they paid me travel pay from Wichita Falls to New Jersey, but I only went to Oklahoma. So I made out like a bandit on that, and I needed the money anyway.
All of this kind of thing with Denver, is this why you think so many of the guys came back and settled here after the war?
Absolutely, because just like us, they absolutely loved it. We went back. After I got discharged, we were in Oklahoma for a year, and it was a small town, and I didn't have a job. I worked in a drugstore for a while, and I didn't have a job, and Michael he was 4 at the time and just getting close to school age. So we looked at each other and says, what are we going to do? We said, well, I called my former boss at Bates, and I said, Mr. Harper, I don't have a job. Can you give me my job back at Bates Manufacturing? He said, if you come back to New Jersey, I'll either give you a job or I'll find you one. So we packed up in Oklahoma and left. And we went to New Jersey. And he put me back to work. By that time, the plant was unionized during the war. And this was an IBEW union because they were making some kind of lights, electrical stuff, for automobiles or trucks or whatever. So it was unionized. So he put me to work under the union rules as an apprentice toolmaker. And I worked there because I had been apprenticed working in a tool room before the war started. And when I left, he put me back in there as an apprentice. No, he put me back in there as a toolmaker second class under the union rules. So then I was a toolmaker, tool and die maker. So we stayed there for a while, and I was made foreman of a department that was making staples, office-type staples. And right after the war, that was one thing that nobody could buy. So they set up the staple department, and I worked with the guys who established it, and was eventually, when they left, their contracts were up, they left, and I was made foreman of the department. Well, I got in trouble with a union member who was a steward in the department and all this and that. And the company, the factory superintendent, wouldn't back me up because I wanted to fire the guy. And the factory superintendent says, you can't fire him. We have to go through the union. And that finished me. So I quit that job and went to work at another plant. And that was also union, but the tool room was not organized. They weren't union. And so one day, they called me in and said, I was working a night shift or something. I don't know. Anyhow, I went home and I said to my wife, I don't know whether I quit or got fired, but I don't have a job anymore. What do we do now? She said, let's go back to Denver. Good, let's go. And we did. In the meantime, I had written to the, whatever they called it, the Department of Labor for the state. And they wrote me a letter and said, we can't promise you a job, but if you're a tool and die maker, we'll welcome you with open arms. And they did. So we came back here in 1956 and never regretted a day of it.
Did you move back to Broomfield, or did you?
No, we lived in East Denver. We lived out in Park Hill at the time. First, when we came in here, we got a furnished room, and then we had an apartment, and then we moved into a duplex in East Denver, out in Park Hill. So,
When'd you come to Broomfield then?
1959, we had a contract on a house out there behind Fitzsimmons. Morris Heights was the name of that development. And we had gone out there and we had a contract on a house out there. And when they went ahead and built the house, and we went out and looked at it a couple of times, and we had, in the contract was written for some extras, built-in kitchen appliances and I don't know what all. Well, when they called us and said, well, the house was finished if you want to come out here and inspect it. And we went out there to Morris Heights, and we walked in. There was nothing in the kitchen. No appliance, no stove, no oven, nothing. And we had it written out in the contract. So we told them, nothing doing. We won't accept it like this. So then after we had a hassle with them, and I had bought this on a GI loan. It was the basis of the contract. And so that we hassled with them for a while. Didn't hear anything from them for a while. And finally we got a telephone call from the guy. And Doris answered the phone and says, what's happening with our house? Did you put those appliances in? He said, no, we couldn't put them in because you didn't sign a paper that you would guarantee the payment for the extras even if your loan didn't go through. So she told him, forget it, you know. So he said, in the meantime, then you didn't sign that paper, so we resold the house on a conventional loan. So there we were stuck. You know, we had no house. We had already given notice that we were moving out of the duplex. So we started looking for a place. In the meantime, the people that were living in the front half of the duplex where we were Bob and Shirley Reeves. And they lived on Burl, or somewhere in the first filing. And Doris had been out here to Broomfield. We looked all over Denver area for a house. Couldn't find anything. So finally, she had come out here to play bridge with Shirley Reeves. And so she said, let's go to Broomfield. Okay. Seemed like it was 1,000 miles away when you drove out here then in 1959. And we came out here, and the first thing that happened to us when we came into Broomfield, no, it was before that. She had come out here to play bridge with Shirley Reeves, and she pulled up on a corner of Old Wadsworth there in Old Broomfield, you know, where the railroad station was, and the grain bin, or whatever they call it, the silo. So she stopped there, and she went around the corner, and a highway patrolman stopped her. And she said, what was I getting stopped for? He said, you went through a stop sign. She said, I didn't see any stop sign. It was hidden behind a tree or something, or a sign. She didn't see it. So he wrote her a ticket. He said, can I see your driver's license? I don't have my driver's license. I left it home. She got 2 tickets the first time she drove out here to Broomfield from the highway patrol. But that was the reason we came back to Broomfield, you know, because we came out here and we liked it, and I had got an extension on my GI loan application, and we bought the house from Fred Spallone down there on 6th Avenue.
Here in Broomfield, what was it like when you got here to Broomfield? Do you remember what the town was like?
Town was mostly in the first filing, of course, and the second filing was just being built at the time when we bought the house from Fred Spallone. That was in 1959. And of course there was no landscaping, there was no trees, there was mud and you name it all over the place. And everybody on the street was in the same boat. They were all newcomers, you know, and we got acquainted with a lot of people, and we had a real good time with them. Everybody contributed something. The guy across the street on the corner of Laurel and 6th Avenue, he was some kind of a salesman or connected with the sales department for Butler Buildings, and Butler Buildings made prefabricated grain bins and stuff like that, you know. And I can remember we were out there one day, and I was barbecuing in the driveway because there was no place else. Every place else was mud. And he came out and he invited us over to his house. Well, we went over there. We were drinking margaritas until a fare-thee-well, and the barbecue never got finished. But it was like that, you know. Everybody was in the same boat. There were more station wagons per square driveway than any place else around. And we were way out in the country, way from everybody else. So it was very close-knit community. So, and we loved every minute of it.
What was the town like? Was there much town here?
No. Safeway store was up there. Well, it's gone now, of course. Let's see. In the shopping center, where the Safeway was, they eventually closed that up, and then the drugstore was in there. And then on the corner of Nickel and Midway Boulevard, and the buildings that were there on that side of the thing, the bank was right there in the corner, Broomfield Bank, and Ken Hoyle was the president at that time. And let's see, what else was there? Well, we had Broomfield Days, and used to have it in the fall. And everybody would set up a booth. You know, we had a booth and we had a parade, and it was a lot of fun then, because the people from the church, the Episcopal Church, although we didn't have a church at that time, they all got together and we had a booth, and Doris and the other ladies, they cooked up sloppy joes, and we had Carl Akers out here and Paul Blue. Both of them were out here in the parade one time, and I don't know, it was marvelous to be in a small town.
What do you think about what's happening today with the growth?
Well, of course, you know, we're retired and we're living here in Gayton Green, and so the traffic bothers us, and we think the city council spends too much money. I don't know what all. Anyhow, we don't like them, and the growth is just overwhelming. Let me say that. That's about the way it is for us. So,
Do you like the idea that we're becoming a county of our own?
no, we don't, and we voted against it. In fact, when the corporation for the city of Broomfield, when the city of Broomfield was incorporated, that was, first vote was 1961, and the vote to incorporate was defeated by 3 votes, I think, and we decided that 2 of those 3 votes were ours, and the other one was Lucy Brown's. Well, I don't know about that. That's something else. And then the next year, when it was on the ballot again, it passed by, I think, 5 votes or something like that. So the town was incorporated. And Don DeCombs was the first mayor. And we liked him. We got along very well, and we thought it was good. And Doris can tell you more about that when you interview her. But we had the one thing I could do, although I was working, was volunteer for the ambulance service because they were looking for volunteers. And they had a 58 Chevrolet station wagon with a 454 engine in it that had been donated by Bal Swan. And used to drive that. And we did mostly transportation, drive to Lutheran Hospital. Or had one old guy one time, Doris was on the police department. And I was home. She was out. She had been someplace with the police department. And got a call about 2 o'clock in the morning, I guess, for the old hotel. You remember, was the old hotel there when you moved in here? It was right there on the railroad tracks, right next to the grain elevator, or right across the tracks from the grain elevator, right there on the corner. Some old guy had fallen out of bed and broke his leg. And they called for the ambulance. So we went over there. We went in the back entrance of that old hotel, and the stairway was just as narrow as it could be, and it went up at about a 45-degree angle. So we climbed up to the second floor where this guy was who had fallen out of bed and splinted him with a magazine, because that was the handiest thing. We splinted his leg with a magazine. Carried him down the stairs, which was extremely difficult because it was so narrow and so steep. And about that time, Brophy and Doris drove up in a police car. So we loaded him in the ambulance, and he says, "Where are you taking me?" We said, "To Lutheran Hospital." He said, "I don't want to go there. I want to go to Veterans Hospital." So I said, "Okay, we'll take you to Veterans." We started out to Veterans Hospital, and he reared up. He said, "Stop someplace and buy me a cigar," which we did. And we get out to Veterans Hospital, and it's middle of the night. So we rang the doorbell. They have a doorbell out there. Everything was locked up, of course. And the duty sergeant or whoever he was, he came and opened the door. We told him we had a guy here who said he wanted to go to Veterans Hospital, and he broke his leg. And so the guy says, "We can't let him in here without papers or something," Says, "Hell, you can't. You got him." We dumped him off right there at Veterans Hospital. Things that happened were...
Meanwhile, Broomfield was without an ambulance for a few hours, huh?
That's right, yeah. Telephone, everything came in by telephone then, They'd call, I don't know who they called originally, but then the dispatch would call by telephone. We still got the same telephone number we had when we moved in Broomfield. So,
What were your reasons for opposing the county?
expense. It was the way they talked, the way they proposed it. Why, it wouldn't be no problem at all. It would only cost so much money, to do all of this, and they wind up spending. That was the reason, because we knew that no way would they ever be able to establish a county with the budget or the estimates that they proposed. So we voted against it. Of course, the argument was made that Broomfield is now in 5 counties, or 4 counties. So they said, well, some people have to go to Brighton, some people have to go here, they have to go every place. And when the police department has a prisoner, they have to haul him if he's arrested in Adams County, he has to go to Adams County Jail and Boulder County Jail and all this kind of stuff. Dora said, we don't arrest that many people, you know. She was on a police department, of course. She said, we don't have that many. So then they came along and these were reasons. We did not think it was feasible. And that being in 4 counties couldn't propose any more burden than we had been living with since they started annexing out of Boulder County. Originally, if you remember, the city of Broomfield was in 1 square mile on the southeast corner of Boulder County. And then they got big ideas and started annexing this and annexing that. And the first thing you know, we wound up in 4 counties, which is unbelievable, actually. 4 different tax rates, all of these things. And they said, oh, we can consolidate all of this stuff. We didn't believe it could be done. And then when it came up for a vote, and they had to get approval from every county in the state, why, all of those people, every county in the state, none of them knew anything about Broomfield. So what did they do? Say, oh yeah, that's a good idea. They voted for it. You know, and we voted against it, of course. And Lucy Newell and Doris, they gripe about everything that goes on. Every time something comes out in the Enterprise or in a Boulder paper about they hired this one, they hired that one, and the salaries were $75,000 or $100,000 or whatever, and then they have to hire an outside whatever was in the paper this week. Why, that was going to cost extra, and oh, they were going to get all this money from the shopping center, and we just don't see how they can eventually keep from defaulting on the bonds that they issued. You know, because the shopping center is not going to last forever. And all around us, they're going to be building other shopping centers. In fact, in a few years, we're going to be wall-to-wall roofs. So anyhow, we thought it would have been better to leave well enough alone. I don't know how much money they're spending for the police department. Dora said you could have bought 1 car and hired 2 officers just to haul the people around to Brighton or to Westminster or wherever they had to go, you know, or to Boulder County Jail. And that would have cost $100,000 instead of the $1 million that they spent or more. So anyhow, those are things.
One other thing, you know, you've talked about your son. How many children did you have?
3.
Okay, what about the others? Were they born here in Colorado?
Mike, our oldest son, was born in Fitzsimmons. Keith was born at Orange Memorial Hospital in Orange, New Jersey. And Cheryl was born at Rocky Mountain Osteopathic Hospital. So 2 of them were born here in Colorado, and Keith was born in New Jersey.
What are they doing now?
Well, Michael is retired from the Arvada Police Department. So what he does now is he's teaching driver's ed. But this is going to come to an end now too. But he is retired from the Arvada Police Department, and he draws his pension. Keith, middle son, he's in California, in Lakeport, California, and he's a carpenter. And I don't know whether he still has it, but he had a contractor's license in California, which I understand was pretty difficult to get. And Cheryl is an ER nurse at Lutheran Hospital. And boy, how she survives that place, I'll never know. You know, that emergency room is the most stressful place you've ever been in your life. So she has, Michael, our oldest son, when he was in the service, he was in Germany, and he was on a leave in Stuttgart, I believe, and he met a young lady there who was Swede, and they were married in Sweden. Her family were Estonians who had emigrated from Estonia about the time the Russians were swallowing up all the Baltic nations. And they left and they went to Sweden, where they lived in an Estonian colony in Gothenburg. And Mike and Aya were married in Sweden, and she didn't want to come when they were married. She didn't want to come to America, and she said, wait until our first child is born. She wanted her first child in Sweden. So she got pregnant, and Eric was born in Sweden. He's the oldest grandson. And then he was only, I don't know, a few months old, I guess, or maybe a year old or something. He was pretty young anyway. They came over from Sweden. In the meantime, Mike had worked, he found a job. He'd been discharged in Europe and found a job working in a Volvo plant. And he learned to speak Swedish. And so they came, and they were here for, about a year, I guess. And what was he doing? Oh, he got down, he worked for the state. One of the jobs that he had was in the archives department downtown. And then Aya was an only daughter, only girl, only child, and totally dependent on her mother. And she didn't like it here. So they went back to Sweden. No, how did that work now? Anyhow, they were here for a year, and she decided that she'd had enough. She couldn't stand it anymore. So she went back to Sweden, but she was pregnant. So the second grandson then was born in Sweden, in Gothenburg or Gothenburg environs, and they stayed there. So Eric had dual citizenship, but Andreas did not, because he was not granted dual citizenship anyway, because he stayed there. And they still live there. We've been over there several times to visit them. So we have two grandchildren, they're not children, they're grown men now. And Cheryl has two grandchildren. She has a son who is 14, and a daughter who is 11. And Keith in California, he was married and he has two children. He has a daughter who's 14 and a son who's 11. So, and they're pretty good friends too. Everybody in our family is friends. Mike, of course, he got divorced from Aya, the Swedish girl. And he had, I don't know, well, he married a young lady, a beautiful girl, and we're still good friends with her, Marilyn. They were divorced for some reason, and we never could understand why or find out why, because neither one of them would ever talk about it. And we're still good friends with Marilyn and her present husband. In fact, they're coming out here this week to visit us, you know. So that's the way it goes. We have 2, 4, 6 grandchildren, and we love every one of them.